Chapter 6. Learning the Lessons. As we stood on the Burundi mountainside, looking at the wrecked Gemini, we felt totally dazed, our minds reeling. Why hadn't we foreseen the danger of downcurrents in the lee of the mountain ridge? Why hadn't we gained more height before we attempted to cross the mountains? We'd have then escaped the marauding winds. The war had accustomed us to crashes, disasters, and the unexpected. But this was different. This wrecked plane was not one of thousands of military aircraft. It was the only one we had. Its broken remains symbolized our own shattered hopes. For 2 years, we'd worked and prepared for this survey. For 2 years, we'd prayed and waited for the funds to buy our plane. For 6 grueling months, we'd flown and landed, talked and listened across the width of Africa. Had it all been for nothing? A dirt track followed a ridge in the mountains above us. After half an hour, 2 Belgian agricultural officers came bumping along it in a Peugeot car. They spotted us and the wrecked plane and scrambled down to where we were. We explained our unhappy situation as best we could in French. After listening to us, they headed off to Bujumbura to inform the airport officials. As we waited in the sun, we were glad to be able to salvage and drink the water we'd brought with us. Several hours later, 2 airport officials arrived and made out a full report. Then they took us to an American mission station a few miles down the mountainside. Unexpected as we were, the missionaries were generous in their hospitality. Their sympathy was a real comfort and encouragement. But the whole incident had left us shocked and dispirited. We tried to sleep through the customary afternoon siesta, but our thoughts and our discussions were too disturbing. In our unwise attempt to save time, we had brought the survey to a halt. Tom Banham in Nairobi received our telegram from Bujumbura informing him of the crash. He wrote to Murray in London. To have been enabled to do so successful a survey and then at the very end to meet with such a disaster is a considerable shock spiritually as well as physically. We shall all need God's guidance about our future decisions. He also wrote to the missionaries and local friends with whom we'd been in contact. Would they retain any confidence in us as an aviation organization? We quite understand that the accident may cause you to have second thoughts as to the desirability of air travel. Before we can decide on action for the future, we need to know your reactions. Above all, we would especially value your prayers. Our roundabout journey back to Nairobi took 9 days. We travelled by lake steamer, by slow train, and by a series of local lorries, which often had to be repaired, pushed, or abandoned. In all, we covered more than 1,000 miles, twice the distance it would have been by air. At least we're learning more about surface travel in Africa, I remarked dolefully. On our way, we found plenty of time to think more about air travel too, as we painfully analysed the events of the past months. The little Gemini had been underpowered for its task. We had struggled with its various limitations. Poor takeoff at high altitudes and in high temperatures, slow rate of climb, difficulty in clearing tall trees at the end of short airstrips, tendency of the small wheels to sink into soft soil on landing. Finally, lack of power had aggravated our problems in the mountains. Special techniques for flying in tropical valleys were later developed by MAF, but at that time we were still learning by trial and error, plenty of both. Back in Nairobi, it was a relief to talk and pray with Tom about what had happened and what to do next. You must get back into an airplane immediately, he stressed, in case you lose your nerve for flying. This was in line with RAF practice following a crash during the war. But we didn't want to waste time and money hiring a plane. Though Jack and I had lost some of what Tom used to call our irrepressible spirits, neither of us felt in any danger of losing our nerve. So he arranged instead for us to have a few days' holiday on the Kenya coast. Much better. As soon as we got back, we started an intensive analysis of all the data we'd collected at the 80 mission stations visited so far. We wanted to get a report out to missions not only on the accident, that was comparatively brief, but also on the findings of the survey to date. We worked hard for 2 weeks, analysing 900 pages of information. Our finished report covered 11 pages plus 4 pages of statistics. It included all the comparisons of surface and air travel emerging from the 5 months of research. We were surprised by what we found. The relative merits of travel by car or plane seemed very evenly balanced. In countries like the Congo, the roads were very carefully maintained by the Belgian colonial authorities. "Why should I need the help of a plane?" one missionary there had asked us. "I can drive my pickup truck in any direction at 70 miles an hour along a good road. When I reach my destination, I've got my vehicle conveniently for local use." His comments were typical of a number of people we met. In more isolated areas, on the other hand, missionaries like Mark Poole at Bulape were understandably enthusiastic about an air service. But looking at the area we had surveyed as a whole, we had to admit that the case for MAF was not as clear and obvious as we had assumed. We had another concern. Would our accident have now put missionaries completely off the whole idea of MAF? We were soon relieved to find that our fears on this score were groundless. Many missionaries were reassured to find our report so objective and thorough, and had actually gained confidence in what we were trying to do. Certainly our accident had stimulated interest and prayer rather than the contrary. We were asked to go ahead with a survey of a small part of northern Tanganyika, which had been postponed after the crash. This we did in a second-hand station wagon. There were some needs there, but at that time the case for an air service was no stronger than we had found elsewhere. Though our survey report was received with encouraging warmth by the missions in Africa, it precipitated a major and unforeseen crisis at our headquarters in London. We had sent Murray Kendon a copy of our preliminary findings, together with some additional comments. We pointed out that many missionaries preferred travel in their own cars or trucks, that the man-hours required to run an air service would equal the missionary hours it saved, that where roads were good and easy on vehicles, costs by air could be a lot higher than costs by road. Conversely, in difficult mountain areas where air travel was most needed, the question mark over safety now loomed largest. Jack, Tom, and I had, of course, been digesting these issues for some weeks. But they had descended on Murray suddenly and en masse. Our previous letters to the London office had concentrated mainly on the interesting and exciting events of our survey. Now, he was faced with the cold analysis of statistical and technical data. He was deeply shocked. In his eyes, our report undermined the very raison d'etre of MAF. He felt we could not have assessed the overall picture correctly. "Where are the examples of an aeroplane saving immense time as compared to slow journeys by mule or canoe?" he asked. "How do the missionaries get to distant medical centres?" We had to reply that those we had met were not making slow, long journeys by mule or canoe, and that generally they seemed to have reasonable road access to medical centres. It was a pity Murray had not been out in Africa with us to see the facts and problems on the spot. It is more than likely that if he had, his visionary enthusiasm would have enabled him to see more possibilities than we or the missions could then imagine. God had truly given him a vision, though we had to wait for its fulfillment. In spite of all these differences of opinion, there remained one country where we had sensed an indisputable need for MAF. The Sudan continued to haunt us. On our initial journey to Nairobi, we'd made some contacts in the Sudan, though it hadn't been part of our main survey. We had inevitably been impressed by its great distances and minimal communications. There were vast areas where there were no real roads at all, and what tracks existed were impassable for months at a time. We'd learned of places where missionaries and their children were out of range of medical help and had died for lack of it. We'd listened to descriptions of those long, slow journeys by boats, canoes, donkeys or mules that Murray had pictured. We asked Mildmay to allow us to make a thorough survey of the Sudan on our way back to England. But the idea had to be abandoned for lack of time, for the insurance company was questioning our claim for the crashed Gemini. Jack and I were urgently needed in London to put the facts before them personally. In November 1948, we flew by the Scandinavian Mission Flight's Ansgar plane to Switzerland and travelled by train to London. Scandinavian mission flights operated for a few years after the end of the Second World War. It enabled missionaries stranded overseas during the war years to come home at last. It also made it possible for others, caught at home, to return to their countries of service. Ansgar, in whose honour the plane was named, was an early Christian missionary from Germany to Denmark in AD 826. Just before we had left England on our survey, an enterprising MAF supporter had thrust a small movie camera into my hands, urging me to bring back our story on film. Equipped with a book on amateur movie making, I had done my best to comply. On our return, Jack and I were kept busy showing the film in churches and sharing the excitement of flying in little-known areas. But after a while, we began to feel we couldn't continue indefinitely stimulating interest if nothing else was happening, and if MAF was unlikely to be involved in flying again soon. This was only one of a series of crises. The insurance company eventually paid out on the loss of the Gemini, but by then the Mildmay movement was running into financial difficulties. It was hard for them to contemplate using the insurance money to buy another plane. So we couldn't plan any further surveys or attempt to set up an air service anywhere, even if we wanted to. Also, although we had sent fuller reports to all the missions whose stations we'd surveyed and maintained active discussions with them, nothing had emerged to trigger the start of a specific service. If we'd had the experience we have now, we would have initiated something ourselves. We'd have known that, at least in some of the areas surveyed, once a plane was available, it would soon be in active use. As it was, because nothing was happening, Jack and I felt we were in limbo. We became increasingly uneasy. A further crisis arose when the Mildmay movement sent Murray to his native New Zealand to stir up interest in MAF, and at the same time conduct an evangelistic campaign there. He left in October 1949, full of enthusiasm, intending to return 6 months later. But in the meantime, Jack and I were left to carry on without him. It turned out to be a time of crucial decisions. Shortly after his departure, an urgent request came from Dr. Don McClure, a pioneer missionary in southern Sudan, appealing to us to set up an air service in the remote region where he was working. The call was strong and specific. But we still had no plane, and Mildmay had little money. Should we face the fact that apart from the Sudan, there appeared to be less scope for using planes in Africa than was originally imagined? Should we give MAF a decent burial? We had a special day of prayer in our office. At the end, we felt more clearly than ever that God was calling us to trust Him and go to the Sudan. But when we approached Dr. Cochrane, he was doubtful. He called a meeting of the Mildmay Council. "Your survey in Africa was hardly a total success, was it?" The council of the Mildmay movement was in session. The table in the council room was long and narrow. The chairman, Mr. Lindsay Glegg, was at one end, Dr. Cochrane at the other. The remaining council members along both sides. Jack and I had been asked to join them. The light from the windows illuminated quite a number of white and grey heads, a venerable group of well-respected people, and they were sceptical about our going to the Sudan. One of the members had just said so. He emphasized it further. "If we let you go out to the Sudan, I can see you coming back within the year with your tails between your legs again." "Why not go to South America?" a lady member suggested. "There are needs and opportunities there. We have requests for an air service in that area. You should take a plane there." We explained. American MAF are already working in South America, and we feel that is the natural area for them, not for us. We don't want to duplicate their work. There was still no enthusiasm for the Sudan idea. Dr. Cochrane was obviously unsure. Only Jack and I were quite clear that we had only two alternatives: to go to the Sudan or to disband MAF. Lindsay Glegg was a man of genial face and gracious manner. A successful businessman, he was also a man of vision, whom God had greatly used to promote Christian outreach in England. Suddenly he spoke up. "I think if these two young men feel God is calling them to go to the Sudan, then we should let them do so." That's all he said. But Jack and I sensed God was fully in control. The council members absorbed his words. They weren't yes men or yes women, yet somehow there was hardly any discussion after that. His proposal was passed. God had intervened. We were allowed to plan to get a plane and go. After the council's decision, we contacted the Sudan government. They would not permit us to operate any small single-engined aircraft over the desolate countryside within their borders, reminding us that they'd already had incredibly expensive experiences searching for lost planes. Having been seriously lost ourselves in the Sudan, we could understand this. There weren't too many twin-engined planes we could afford without spending more than the insurance settlement from the Gemini. The only one of reasonable size and price was the veteran de Havilland Rapide. Rapides had first been designed and built in the 1930s, twin-engined biplanes with space for 8 passengers and a crew of 2. Made of wood, fabric and metal, their slender, pointed, dragonfly-like wings were braced with innumerable struts and wires. Thousands had been made and flown all over the world. Their performance was adequate for the relatively flat, low-lying regions of the Sudan, and they were acceptable to the Sudan government. Having been used for training RAF radio operators during the war, the Rapide we bought already had a heavy military Marconi receiver and transmitter. It had also been used for navigation training and had a special drift sight, which would be invaluable for our own navigation. Plans went ahead for our departure to the Sudan. Jack was now married, and Helen, his wife, was to come with us. The target date for leaving was early March 1950. At this point, a final crisis occurred. Dr. Cochrane appeared in our office with the treasurer of the Mildmay movement. "I've got bad news," he said. "Our finances are in a difficult state. I'm afraid we're going to have to sell the Rapide." This really was a blow, especially when Lindsay Glegg's move to let us go to the Sudan had previously been accepted by the council. Amazingly, Jack and I felt quite calm. We were sure God had already made the situation clear to us. "Dr. Cochrane," we told him, "if that is what has to be, so be it. In that case, we must wind up MAF too." "All right, I'll let you go," said Dr. Cochrane, without even a sideways glance at his startled treasurer. "But we may have to sell the plane at any time." It was on that basis that we headed out to the Sudan. I can tell you now, that plane was never sold.